Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again on this Wednesday evening. The time is just gone 7 minutes past 7 p.m. Central African time. As we welcome you once again to the airwaves of Salam Media, we welcome our listeners and viewers at ITV this evening. And it is Wednesday night with myself, Inayet Wadee. Now, we've seen in the last few months a lot of focus, a lot of effort on the part of the government talking about SOEs, and we've just seen so much going on by way of blame game. But the bottom line is we know that the SMEs have been destroyed, they have been handicapped to a large extent. And the key issue here is job losses and how this is impacting on people that are working for these SOEs. And we've also seen a press release come out not too long ago, in fact, on the 26th of November, where we've seen this press release come out talking about austerity measures, talking about a number of issues. But the key question here is, how is this impacting on the economy? How is this impacting on workers? And we've seen the Communication Workers Union issue this press release talking about these austerity measures coupled with irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure. And it is against this background that we are having this panel discussion this evening. And we are joined by a panel of experts. We're talking with Mametlwe Sibait this evening. We've got Hamida Dirat, and hopefully we also will be joined by Clyde Mervyn, who is with the CWU. Now, Clyde Mervyn is the president of the Communication Workers Union, Hamida Dirat, the acting director of the National Labour and Economic Development, and Mametlwe Sibait, president of the General Industries Workers Union in South Africa. And just looking up at my screen, I see Mametlwe Sibait has joined us. Good evening to you, Mametlwe. Thank you for your time and making time out in joining us this evening on this panel discussion.
Good evening to you and to our listeners. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and join this discussion.
Yes, obviously there has been a lot of focus, and while we are waiting for the other two panelists to join us, and just to begin with, and I'm not too sure whether you had you've had a look at the press release by the CWU, but I'm sure that the General Industries Workers Union South Africa has got similar concerns, and you are expressing similar sentiments with regard to SOEs, with regard to job losses in the country. Well, it does appear, Mametlwe, there seems to be a bit of a delay coming through, possibly some signal issues, but we have got Hamida Dirat online. Hamida, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Walaikum salam.
Yes, Hamida, we appreciate you taking time out and talking to us this evening. Sorry?
No problem. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Right, Hamida, let's start. I see Mametlwe. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, fine. Have you heard the question that I've asked you? Yes. Have you heard the question that I've asked you?
Yes. I was saying that the issue of job losses is a concern of major interest to us as we are speaking at the moment. GIUSA is on strike at Clover, where there is 1,400 job losses in this period. But I think, it goes beyond that. The issue of state-owned entities as well. As you are aware, SAF2 Central Committee is meeting, and one of the resolution that it has taken is around state-owned entities. Of course, our position was to emphasize that we want those state-owned entities that have been privatized to be renationalized, including ISCO and others. But of course, that poses a question: what do we do about rampant corruption, looting, and of course, collapse of the state-owned entities under this government? And I think for us, it is really a question of the class interests that are driving the state-owned entities, because under capitalism, under a bourgeois government such as the one of the ANC, state-owned entities and public-owned
Mameshe, we are losing you slightly. Losing you slightly. Hopefully, we will get you on a better line. But just to bring Hamida into the discussion. Now, Hamida, clearly the theme of the discussion is to look at government's policies with regards to SOEs. And one person in particular, the man in charge, we're talking about Pravin Gordhan. And there have been huge question marks with regard to his policies, his management style, which some say that has been disastrous for SOEs in the country.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to engage him as a person in terms of his management and his management style. I think I'd rather be focusing on the kinds of decisions that he's making in relation to our state-owned enterprises. So I mean, I think it's just not him, but also we need to look at this within the context of government's orientation in terms of its macroeconomic policy and its economic trajectory that it has planned for South Africa. As you know, we see, I mean, the QLSS has just released its latest figures, and it's showing that unemployment is sitting at 50%. We see government, from last year implementing measures that lead to austerity, meaning that the government has chosen to consciously not spend within the public sector. It's retracting in the economy, and as a result, we're seeing major retraction, and we're seeing impoverishment and the quality of life becoming very, very hard for people, for the ordinary person. I think what's also difficult is in the same vein. If you take our history, we had very good functioning state-owned enterprises. There was massive operation and maintenance, and there was also quite a lot of value placed on these enterprises being within the public sphere, and government making a commitment to actually ensuring that they were run effectively and efficiently. Now, the word efficiently and effectively in the context of privatization is normally being chanted as the way to go. And the words inefficiency and being ineffective, I think, are words that are also being bandied around in relation to the public sector now. But this inefficiency, and if you just take Eskom as a simple example, it's actually it's very complicated as an entity. But I'm saying simple in the context in the sense that lots of people have experienced load shedding. We've seen maladministration, we've seen changes of CEOs, high levels of corruption, we've seen retrenchments, load shedding, and burning of subsettings, sabotage. And this is a state-owned enterprise that historically was functioning at its prime, was able to ensure the economy was running, was a major contributor towards employment. The economy of the country, based on its energy supply, meant that we had energy sovereignty, and therefore there was in terms of our own form of industrialization, despite the fact that it was fossil fuel driven, was a progressive one, and it was beneficial and developmental for our country. Now, when you start eroding your state-owned enterprises, but not for willy-nilly, but more so because there's a particular agenda, i.e. privatization, that's been put as your niche. Also maladministration on the part of government, and also unchecked corruption and major amounts of theft, then you'll see state-owned enterprises go down and start becoming completely inefficient, eroding. And the next issue would be, well, the public sector is inefficient. There's poor management, there's corruption, and therefore we need the investment of either the private sector, or we need to sell off our state-owned enterprises. We've seen the same in terms of PRASA. We've seen the same in terms of SAA, and the list is endless. I mean, Telkom is another example, and that's why it's very important that the president from the Communications Workers Union is on board, and I think also deal with that. So this is a conscious decision by people who actually recognize that the public sector. So when you're working within an economy, when the public sector, particularly within the context of services, is actually a guaranteed profit-making mechanism or an institution from which you can make profits, what you do is you set up the state through mechanisms of corruption and mismanagement in a way that the public sector goes down the tube, or the infrastructure goes down the tube, and that's the perfect stage for the private sector to enter. if you ask anybody, and I'm sure on your chat group, if you have to ask people, how many people support the fact that ESCOM should actually be in the hands of the private sector as opposed to the public sector or within government, people will actually vote, well, actually, you know what, we're so tired of ESCOM, we should just go and privatize it if it is that the delivery of our electricity is going to be better. What people forget is once you have monopoly capitalism and you move into privatization of a public utility and a public service and a public good, rights become undermined, and the cost of electricity and our own electricity sovereignty will be removed. And that will have a major economic implication, both for our industry, for development, and for ordinary people at large. If you look at the current three things that actually increase every single year and that people are really struggling to pay for, it's the petrol prices in terms of transport, it's electricity, and it's food. And each of these have key inputs, and they directly connected to each other in terms of the value chain. So in the long term, if you move...
Hamida, can I just stop you there for a minute? I just want to bring Mametlwe into the discussion. And Mametlwe, obviously you've been hearing and listening to what Hamida has been saying. Now, the key question here is Pravin Gordhan, in his defense, has always maintained that blame and anger must be placed at the door of those who destroyed and handicapped these state-owned enterprises. But again, the other side of the argument in terms of deliberate mismanagement in the interest of privatization and private interests. And I think this has been a major talking point, a major, and Hamida has alluded to that as well, in the interest of or private interests. And I just need your thoughts looking at where these SOEs are and what this would actually mean should these enterprises go into private hands. Well, I think Mametlwe has frozen for some reason or the other. We're going to try and get hold of him on a better line, and we will continue with Hamida. Hamida, perhaps you'd like to just comment on this in terms of, I see Mametlwe has come back to us. Mametlwe, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, all right.
Just to say that, I mean, so it is certainly true. I mean, we see it world over that whenever the state, or rather the capitalist class, want to, privatize public property, they first start by mismanaging it, and of course discrediting it, as they have been doing in this country through a relentless propaganda, about how public ownership doesn't work. And I think they use their own mismanagement as an example of that. So there is that side to it. But I think also the issue of corruption is not just with a sole intention of privatizing. I think corruption is inherent in the very relationship of public and private sector under capitalism itself, because these public-owned assets, what they intend with this type of government, such as the one of the ANC, is obviously to bolster a corporate profits in the private sector. I mean, if you look at what's happening at ESCOM, for instance, right, there has been a deliberate attempt to undermine the supply by...
Yes, Mametlwe, I think we are losing you again. We're going to have to get you on the better line. Unfortunately, it's actually sounding very, very bad because we can't hear a single thing that you are saying. There is quite an echo, and my engineer is going to try and get in touch with you on a better line. But Hamida, let's just continue. And I know you wanted to make a comment on the issue that I had raised with regard to a deliberate mismanagement in the interest of privatization.
Yeah, so I think, I want to pick up on the point that the comrade made. So corruption is not unique to the private sector. It also happens in the public sector, and I think you've got several examples of that. But and usually, and I think our the fact that all our SOEs are in disarray stands to the test. So it basically attests to that fact. I think the key issue is when you, so if you look at where your economy is driven, as I was indicating, the extent to which the public sector or governments provide and subsidize infrastructure and build a public entity, right? That costs major investment. But once capital, in terms of investors wanting to come into your country, they recognize, particularly when you look at the crises within capital, they recognize that certain sectors are better placed to provide profits than others. And the services sector is becoming, has historically and is also fast becoming an area that more and more countries are starting to privatize. Now, historically, when we had the anti-privatization forum around about the late 1990s going into 2000s, the trade union movement, as well as civil society organizations through the anti-privatization forum, the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, SAMU as a very, very strong public sector union, really took on government and international institutions quite vociferously and arguing that we're not going to support privatization. But neoliberalism and the way in which governments have been captured, the onslaught of the private sector and its entry point, wanting to viciously engage and enter into our markets, are things that we're seeing. And one of the things that facilitates their entry and basically brings the downfall to the public sector is the issue of corruption. There's also the issue of and corruption, not just in terms of theft, but also mismanagement. So if you take Eskom as an example, the number of skilled personnel were not actually brought into Eskom after the older, predominantly white engineers had left the sector. Then there's the issue of operation and maintenance. So you've got a personnel issue where you're not actually bringing in and replenishing and also doing handover in relation to skilled personnel to run the Eskom coal-fired power stations. Then when you look at the second issue in relation to operation and maintenance, it's exactly the same thing as a car. You can't keep driving a car and not doing operation and not doing a service. So the same with our coal-fired power stations. If you do not do operation and maintenance, and if you also don't plan for the fact that after a certain period of time, which is the way in which our power stations are built, there's going to be a point where they're going to have to be decommissioned. Now, if coal-fired power stations are going to be decommissioned and you don't make a plan prior to the fact that they've got 3 or 4 years left in terms of their lifespan, how are we actually going to deal with the issue of our electricity? Then you look at the issue of Medupi and Kusile. The manner in which these contracts were actually set up, highly privatized, supported by the World Bank in one instance, but the conditions of the contract. So to give you a simple example, the South African government negotiated the contract in dollars. They didn't fix the exchange rate, and at the time when the contract with Medupi was negotiated, the rand to dollar exchange rate was 7 rand to the dollar. We're now sitting at 15 rand to the dollar, which means that we're actually paying double the price, or 200% on every rand. So almost 10 years later, right? So we're paying Medupi off several times over. But what's worse is the people who are actually building the actual coal-fired power station don't have the necessary skills, have used the wrong infrastructure. Many times, at many instances, the actual the material that they were using, or the turbines, what they were using was actually incorrect, and it's taken way longer to actually build the Medupi plant than it should actually be. So all of these factors together then demonstrate to us as the public, or for those of us who don't understand what the broader orientation is, that actually there's a failing state. If you look at the way the municipalities at the local level are actually failing, and I'm just using, I know your issues around state-owned enterprises, but if you look at local government to juxtapose what's happening in SOEs, the same thing. So when you have a failure of a state at various levels, including our SOEs, if you see that they are incapable of actually delivering, the common sense response would be, well, let's look to an investor or to somebody who can actually save us. And as I'm saying in the context of Eskom, if an investor comes tomorrow and says, actually, you know what, we'll invest, in fact, we'll take away coal, we'll bring you renewable energy, And even though the actual production of renewable energy or energy through renewables could potentially be cheaper, once they own through a concession or a 30-year contract, once they own the right to produce our energy, they will determine the price, they will do operation and maintenance, and any cost that they do not want to carry will simply be transferred onto the user. That's how privatization works. We
Yes,
will not.
Hamida, I see Mametle is back with us, so let me just bring him back into the discussion. Now, Mametle, I think there are two issues here, and perhaps I just like your thoughts when one puts these state-owned enterprises into context. Okay, we've got, for instance, we've got SARS, which is also a state-owned enterprise. Okay, and we haven't seen the failure in SARS as we have seen in many of the others, because on the one hand, SARS is collecting money. So in terms of systems, in terms of maintenance, in terms of making sure the skills base is there, qualified people, the government has actually ensured that SARS is basically a world-class state-owned enterprise, and that is the job that they're doing at this point in time, because they are collecting money. But on the other hand, when one looks at all the others where money is being spent, and this is where there is this lack of focus. But because of this lack of focus, it is workers. It is workers who are paying a huge price. They are paying a massive price in this country.
And that is because it's not just government that is interested, obviously, in the treasury and its institution functioning very well. Actually, it's the entire ruling class. And I think as you would recall, how the capitalist class reacted when Zuma tried to appoint David van Rooyen, that itself signifies how obviously the entire class is committed to a certain architecture of political governance of their system, over which they do not want, even government, including the ANC, just to be tampering with it willy-nilly. But the point that I've been trying to highlight, and I think I should try to insist on, is that the problem that we have to recognize is that this corruption, there is an issue of individual misconduct, right? But this corruption is also very functional to the very accumulation of capital by many private industries that are linked to, ESCOM themselves. Just look, with the state-owned entities. Just look at ESCOM as an example. Beside the issue of a deliberate choice of small truck owners over state-owned entities like Transnet to supply coal to ESCOM, there's an issue about the kind of arrangement that ESCOM has entered into. 10% of electricity that is supplied by ESCOM is consumed by one company, BHB Billiton, that is contributing less than 1% of the income. Now, when we have an arrangement like that, how do you expect such a state-owned entity where 10% consumer of its electricity is contributing only about 1% of its income? That would not be sustainable. And that is the reason that we're in this crisis. And that, in a final analysis, is because state ownership of enterprises under capitalism is for the purpose of bolstering the profits and to be in the service of corporate sector, not in the interest of the working class and the poor.
Yes, and Hamida, also we've seen comments come through from some of the other political parties, and I know the EFF in particular has raised this issue with regard to Pravin Gordhan being given a mandate to destroy some of the state-owned enterprises. And if I recall, quite a while back, they referred specifically to ESCOM, to SAA, and also the whole neoliberal agenda that is playing out, saying that it's neoliberalism on steroids.
Yeah, look, I don't want to deal with the personal. I don't want to go in line with, I don't support the way in which Malema makes really ugly accusations and makes it exceptionally personal. But if you ask the question, do I believe that Pravin's orientation towards our state-owned enterprises is neoliberalism on steroids? Absolutely. If you say that his orientation is not about building the public sector, I think the issue of SAA is quite an interesting case in point. Many people would say, well, because of all of the corruption and the extent to which SAA had deteriorated and all the money that was actually poured into it, the best thing would have been to reprioritize maybe health, education, or the public sector, and actually just let SAA, die off. I think he came to the rescue, and I think in many instances, because there were jobs from a union perspective, people were arguing that in actual fact, we should say South African Airways, both in terms of the fact that historically it plays a significant role in relation to us having an opportunity to travel the world, but to an airline that was domestic. The reason for its failure, of course, was because it moved from a public institution and operating as a public enterprise to operating like a commercial entity, which was completely unfettered, unregulated, and so was the corruption. So the interesting thing is, if you see how SAA is being saved, inverted commas, it's still a public-private partnership. And the operations or the modus operandi is privatization. So as much as we have SAA operating, it's operating and the returns on the investment is for the investor more than it is for us as South Africans who have an airline that is supposed to be a public entity. So I think that's the orientation, and Pravin definitely subscribes to privatization and neoliberalism. Absolutely.
Yes. Now, also, Mametle, talking about public-private partnerships now, and also looking in the context of an unequal society. And we've known for far too long that South Africa has been described as one of the most unequal societies. And looking at the kind of partnership that Hamida is talking about, public-private, can it really work? And at the end of the day, in whose interest, number one? And also at the end of, the key question here is, how does the country, how does the poor, how do workers benefit out of all this, out of a partnership of this nature?
Firstly, I mean, let's be clear about it. Those sort of partnerships will not work. They don't work, and they've never worked anywhere. And to the extent that people continue to promote them, including universities, that where they are being promoted, under masquerading as science, there is no proof, not a single instance that I've ever read of success. Because reality is, even if you were to have a business owning just 1% in a 99.9 state-owned entity, that entity has to function on the basis of profit making. And I think the point that Comrade Amida make is correct. Once you have a profit making as a main drive and a motivation of an enterprise, it means public needs, it means the needs of the working class and poor people become secondary if they become a factor at all. Because private profit making is about capital accumulation for its own sake, rich getting richer, and just no any other purpose. The second thing is that in every single one of those instances, it is usually the private owners who end up actually, taking advantage of the fact that public is unable to exercise a direct oversight. And we have a number of companies. I mean, one of the companies that we organize here, here in Johannesburg, that where GUSA was on a strike, is called South Point. It's a property owning company. Big significant shares of it are owned by UIF, which is my insurance for unemployment, of me and you and many other people and workers in this country. The reality is that when you look at the way in which that company is working, you can see how UIF and how public that is invested in the company will not be benefiting, but what entity they've created is an entity which will only be absorbing cost, whilst profits, of course, goes to the private owners. No matter how much of share they own in that. The management is working in the service of those private owning interests, whilst public is merely, absorbing the cost and expenses and nothing else. So that is the reason that we've got to speak about, ownership by who for who. Because when you say the state, meaning you remove the ownership from a private entity, the question only shifts. Who owns the state? The state under capitalism is a bourgeois state that fundamentally functions for the interest of the capitalist class, for the private motivation and capital accumulation in the economy. And any other thing is subordinated to that, including how state-owned entities are functioning. The role of ESCOM is not to provide, affordable electricity. If they do that, is of course incidental. The primary role of it, from its inception, and it continues to be so, is to ensure that it provides a cheap electricity to a private corporations in the mining and other so-called intensive users that are in special tariff agreements where ESCOM sell electricity to them, below the cost of production, whilst me and you have to make for a shortfall in terms of what these entities have to earn to make themselves sustainable. So none of that is in the interest of the working class, and that's the reason that we are saying that public ownership must be under a democratic control of workers and working class communities to ensure that these entities are managed, are controlled, and of course they are planned in such a way that they can serve public and of course the working class and poor majority in particular.
Thank you for that one. Hamida, I've got a comment that has come through, and I'd just like your thoughts on this one, where the viewer says, connecting the dots means one has to unpack and critically understand that CR17 is a capitalist and multinational counter-revolutionary movement that has penetrated state and hollowed out SOEs. So hence in your own country, Kulula and British Airways make great profits, yet SAA and Mango is sabotaged by the DPE. Every SOE is followed by the same playbook. ESCOM and Transnet next in a big bang way. Connect the dots. CR17, Oppenheimer's, Gordhan, Emmanuel, Ramos, Rothschilds, and Goldman Sachs. Your comment, Hamida.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's quite a lot of commentary and discussions in relation to the issue around state capture. So I think it wasn't just, when one thinks about President Zuma, people talk about state capture. But I think if we go back to, when the ANC were negotiating with F.W. de Klerk, our democracy, there were certain trade-offs. And we know, for example, that reference is made to the sunset clauses. We also know when we look at the country and you look at who owns the wealth, fundamentally the exchange of hands and the redistribution of wealth from the wealthy, which were predominantly white, to the historically black, and I'm saying black in the most comprehensive sense, in terms of historically black South Africans, and disadvantage that has not taken place. And when you see this high levels of unemployment, an erosion of our education system, de-skilling, deindustrialization, withering away of our manufacturing sector, and our capabilities, our domestic capabilities, and most importantly, as the comrade has indicated, the issue around our state-owned enterprises, with workers, unfortunately, and communities and ordinary people and the poor in particular suffering. I think the comrade is right who made the comment. You have to join the dots. And I think the writing is on the wall. I think when you look at the local government elections, 70% of South Africans do not go out to vote. That signifies deep, deep levels of disappointment and dissatisfaction, but most importantly, I think a vote of no confidence in our current ANC government. Now, that really places us in a very difficult position because we don't really have a prospective alternative, both from a Labour perspective, because we cannot go into an alliance with the DA, neither can we go into an alliance with the EFF or other political parties. The National Democratic Revolution, which the ANC had put forth in conjunction with the SACP, are still aspirations to which we strive. But unfortunately, the mechanisms and comrades who historically come from our movement, who have been deployed with a particular mandate in order to achieve the NDR, are actually failing us deeply. And I think what we're starting to see is gains that workers and the trade union movement at large, but also ordinary South Africans, gains that we've made under apartheid, are slowly but surely being eroded, with the quality of life really being depreciated to a point where people are actually severely impoverished. And when you look at the issue of the crime levels, the kidnappings that we're seeing, the levels of starvation, the homelessness, all of these, in conjunction with the fact that government still continues to say that they need to push an austerity budget and support privatization and foreign direct investment as the growth path for the country, I couldn't have said it better than the person who made the comment.
Yes. Now, we see there's another question come through, and I'm sure, Mamatla, you can just attend to this one, where Tebogo Salsa says, why is the South African Post Office undermining the public protector recommendation on how to recoup the money lost, and why SEPO is not the one licensing this private courier companies? What is the role of unions in this?
I think a part of the problem, insofar as a trade union is concerned, is also lack of the understanding of the organic character, of the crisis that you are facing. Because this is not a passing storm, as I think I've had a number of comrades, especially from our, from within the ranks of COSATU and other federations, characterizing the crisis, but also on their left, EFF, the RET forces. I mean, the bottom line is that, and I don't want to even debate the conspiracies, that this is a problem of Gordhan as well. I mean, trying to reason with the RET forces, as one commentator correctly pointed out, is just trying to, baptize, cats. That's what you end up with. There is just no coherent argument you're going to get there. At the core of the problem is a crisis of capitalism, the crisis of accumulation, and the fact that the capitalist class want a profitable outlet for investment of what last time I checked was 1.4 trillion that is being hoarded by big corporations in this country. And because of the declining levels of profitability, in the private sector, we've been having a problem with that. So the result of which is that they are opening outlets for investment in the public sector. And part of that is obviously attacking viability of these sectors, precisely so that they can discredit them. Hence, there's a merit on that. But I think we have to go beyond the conspiracy in terms of, who and which faction of the capitalist class is, doing what. The reality is there is no way of managing capitalism in the current epoch of decline in profits, of a crisis of accumulation, other than through privatization, other than through a brutal austerity that has been visited on the working class, both in a private but also in a public sector. In a private sector, as I said, there is massive retrenchment that are taking place, wage freezes, but also wage cuts, and a brutal, attacks on the benefits and gains that workers afford over generations. So, what is an alternative? COSATU has to come out of the alliance. The problem is not just Gordhan and C17. The problem is the ANC. The moment that the ANC accepted management of capitalism is that it was going to bear the primary responsibility of launching the war and the offensive that they've been at the forefront of leading, insofar as attacking the working class at the behest of the capitalist class. I mean, they're the ones that, for instance, this year and last year have led in terms of wage freezes in the public sector, not always because government can afford it, but simply because whatever that is happening in the public sector become a benchmark on the basis of which capitalist class negotiate with us in the mining industry, in the private industry, in the pharmaceutical and chemical sector where I organize. So this is a reality. The National Democratic Revolution is no more than reality, a betrayal of the struggle for socialism in this country.
Yes, and Hamida, just following up from the last few comments that we've heard, talking about the ANC, talking about capitalism, and this is a comment that we've heard over and over again, where the ANC have become more capitalist than the capitalist countries themselves. And as a result, we've just seen recently talks again of South African jobs, talking of a bloodbath. And when Mametre speaks about, brutal, we're talking about merciless. And this is exactly what is happening. And it does appear that apart from the working class, there isn't a concerted effort on the part of the government to stop this brutality in terms of job losses. We've seen labor summits come and go. We've seen so many boss barracks. We've seen so much take place, but more talk, less action. And that is the reason why the working class is where it is today.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Comrade Sibi would also, I think, on this one agree with me. The tensions within the ANC and the issue around capitalist class and the tensions between who was actually advancing a true socialist agenda vis-a-vis the NDR was always a tension within the ANC. I think it's not as if people emerged, without those tensions existing. I think the frightening part is one has seen this in terms of history. When a labor movement becomes part of a government that's in power, but when the government, so for example, if you take Brazil, in terms of Kut being part of the Lula government, and then historically what had actually happened when Lula had come into power. I mean, the reality is our governments do not operate in a vacuum. And as I indicated, historically, when our freedom and our democracy was being negotiated, it was negotiated with certain terms and conditions. And that in and of itself demonstrated that the state was captured. So, I mean, if you look at the struggle in relation to the CR17, it took, there were certain compromises, and I think people like Opalakire, who's just recently passed away, and a whole lot of other left thinkers who've done a critique on what actually happened at Nasrec and how it that, the President Ramaphosa got into power. All speak, they raise issues around capitalist interests and capitalist trusts and the capitalist trust. And I think there were clear signaling, even by the time, President Ramaphosa became the president, that he was a millionaire and he had vested interests. So the challenge is, how does one balance that? And I think from without getting into a whole discussion around the alliance, I don't think I'm the right person to have that discussion with. But I think there were certain strategic reasons why COSATU chose to be in the alliance. I think obviously the spaces are starting to close. There's many instances when we also, as a research institute trying to support COSATU, have to do reflections in relation to, well, usually it's the bosses and the workers, but when the bosses happen to be your alliance partner, your comrades that you've gone through a struggle with, and for example, as Comrade Sibi was indicating, the 0% increase in the public sector, when in actual fact there's several options in terms of where you can make a commitment to the public sector, and more so make a commitment to workers in the public health sector, particularly in the context of COVID-19. So these challenges and really coming up, if you look at Tito Mboweni, Tito as well, coming from the labor movement, he was within the Department of Labor. And when he moved into becoming the Minister of Finance, it's almost like he was schizophrenic. We couldn't recognize the person we had, as Tito as the Minister of Labor, as a comrade, and then you get him in the Department of Labor, and everybody in labor, in organized labor, was saying Tito must go. Now you look at Comrade Enoch who's historically come from NUMSA. Again, one would have thought quite a progressive union, socialist in orientation, key to to advancing the National Democratic Revolution, and there you are. You've got the same song being sung with a greater fervor. So I mean, the challenge that we're having goes beyond the personalities. It's really deep rooted it's structural. It's because of it's a historical past. It's the compromises that we've made, and I think what's really painful, I think, to watch as a South African is that historically, when we were contesting the issue of the capitalist class, capitalist interests, and it was done within a racial configuration of the state of apartheid, we understood who the enemy was. I think now the waters are murky. Some instances, if you take the issue of COSATU comrades at senior levels within the various affiliates are also ANC members. And when they go to the ANC Congress, or when they're engaging at an ANC level, you hold, the hat that you wear is one of the ANC. And then when you come back to your affiliation, in terms of as an affiliate of COSATU, you then have to speak to the interest of workers. So it's really a challenge. And I think even within the union and federation itself, I think it's placing a lot of space. And I think it's a heavy weight in terms of being able to define what is it that we do and how do we advance it. But I think overall, in terms of government's orientation towards supporting the working class, alleviating poverty, really speaking to the key fundamental issues to improve the quality of life for the majority of South Africans, I don't think that's on the agenda at all. The fact that the macroeconomic policy, and with the fourth wave of COVID sitting on our doorstep, the fact that we haven't seen, for example, the universal basic income grant come to the fore. Neither has we seen major support systems in relation to food parcels. I think I read an article where one of the countries in Africa, way poorer than us, was able to use an electronic system and ensure that every single person, I think it was in Togo, every single person was able to get food parcels without any corruption. They were able to get access to funding. I think it was in relation to a grant. They were able to get a grant without any corruption. And the manner in which the system was put up, not highly sophisticated, but sophisticated enough to ensure that there was no corruption and that the people who required the money got the money and were able to have to eat and survive destitution during COVID. The fact that our government has failed in that context, and that the perpetrators of corruption, particularly in the context of COVID, I think even in the context of SOEs, go unfettered. There's no punishment for anybody except the poor and the working class and the historically disadvantaged. I think that for somebody who's working in the space is one of the most painful things to witness in the context of our dispensation. And I must be honest, under the ANC government.
Mametloe, we've got about 7 minutes, and just looking at where we are now, I see there's a quick comment that's come through. I just want to comment on this, where Tibaho says, why is ITV not paying its workers' salaries? We can't only talk of SOEs and forget the brutality played by the private sector. Tibaho, we are aware that there are issues at ITV, but unfortunately, I cannot comment. This is a Salam Media production, and the ITV obviously just taking our feed. But I know that there are some issues that are playing out in the background, but it would be unfair for me to comment because I have no direct relationship with ITV. Muhammad Vermeulen says, it is sad to note that this government, who has the mandate to eradicate unemployment, is actually contributing more to the unemployment rate through the retrenchments that is taking place in SOEs, which is what we have been talking about, and also saying that SAPO, as we speak, announced that they want to reduce staff by 6,000. Now, with the job bloodbath, with all these proposed job losses, Mametle, looking at where we are at this point in time, what should we be focusing on? Is there anything that can be done? Are there any approaches that can be made to government? What actions are at our disposal?
Well, like I've said, I think the starting point has to be that we are dealing here with an organic crisis of capitalism, I think, which manifests itself at all levels of society, right? And I think the economic crisis is one manifestation, and I think a foundational manifestation of that crisis. But nonetheless, there is collapse of society at all levels. I mean, explosion of gender-based violence, the crisis as well of climate change, the crisis of growing unemployment. Every level of society is in crisis. And I think at this point in time, the discussion about tinkering with the system here and there is not going to help us. And I beg to, differ with, Comrade Amanda, insofar as he says that, she says that post 1994, the enemy has become murky. It has not. The enemy is very clear. The ANC has joined the ranks of the ruling class, and therefore the ANC is a class enemy. There is just no two ways about it. And to the extent that you have all of these actions, which even from the point of view of public fiscal do not make sense, it is because the ANC is at the forefront. Lenin makes a point that government under capitalism is an executive committee of the capitalist class. You look at what they are doing in the public sector insofar as wage freezes, is of course to give a green light to capitalists negotiating with us in all key sectors of the economy to be able to follow and to give them justification for that. You look at what the comrade is saying about crisis in the private sector. As I said, we are on a strike at Clover. Clover was taken by an Israeli-owned entity, Milco, in 2017. We objected, 2019, I think. We objected to that takeover. Government supported that. And they were saying that this investment is part, or rather a response of the private sector to, a call for a foreign direct investment on the part of Cyril Ramaphosa, of the president, call and so on and targets for investment. What has happened since that time? Not a single job was created in spite of a blatant lie that this merger would result in creation of about 500 jobs. As I'm talking to you now, over 1,400 workers are losing their jobs. Four factories, Hebron, Frankfurt in Free State, Lichtenberg in Northwest, but also here, City Deep is been, they have been closed. An over 100 years old biggest dairy manufacturer in the country has been taken over by an imperialist state that is engaging in a brutal colonial occupation of Palestine, is destroying our biggest supplier of dairy product in this country. And this government says that sort of investment is response to presidential call for foreign direct investment. So for me, the crisis is capitalism itself. The ANC has taken responsibility of managing the interests of the capitalist class and therefore of capitalism itself. They've clarified their class loyalty. I mean, at Marikana, the ANC has clarified where it stands in relation to both classes in the most bloodiest fashion when it decided to drown the struggles of the workers, in blood. The mine workers who brought this government to power, who are the people who made a career of the current president, they were drowned in blood. For what? For defense of the corporate profits in that section of, in that section of the industry and so on. That is how the ANC has clarified its class loyalty. The only people who are not clear of where the ANC stand is not the ANC, is not the working class in this country, is not imperialism, is COSATU leadership. COSATU must get out of the alliance, must join with us in SAFTU as with the rest of the labor movement, of course, campaigning for a formation of a genuine workers' party on a program for socialism where we can nationalize the mines, the banks, the factories, the farms, and take the commanding heights of the economy onto public ownership, but also under a democratic control and management of the working class to ensure that these key industries are mobilized to overcome the crisis that is faced by a poor majority in the working class in this country. The crisis of massive unemployment that is growing day in, day out. The crisis of a massive backlog of housing in our cities, of public transport. We have to end the crisis that is a crisis of capitalism, which has been made a crisis of the working class by this government and the entire capitalist class. And for as long as the leadership of the workers' movement is committed to an alliance which has served the benefits, which has served the capitalist class at the expense of their own members, we will not be able to get there. So therefore, we are making this call. COSATU has to get out of the alliance as in yesterday.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Hamida, we're obviously running out of time. I've got the last few minutes. Perhaps just some final comments and final thoughts from you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Inayet. So I'm not going to comment on the alliance. I think my comrade and I get along very well, and I think there's different tiers and layers at which one engages on that level. And I think that, in terms of the engagements between SAFTU and COSATU, the general secretaries of the different affiliates, they would take the issue of whether COSATU stays in the alliance or not and what that means for the struggle in terms of the working class. I think where I want to end off is on the issue of the comment that was made by one of the participants in relation to IPPs. I mean, the independent power producers is precisely, I mean, when you're looking at the issues of SOEs, he or she is making an absolutely critical point. The fact that the South African government has actually chosen to do IPPs rather than taking, which is your independent power producers, through renewable energy, instead of actually saying that renewable energy or produced by solar or wind farms should actually be kept within the public entity, within the public space. It should be a public utility that runs it, and in fact, it should be incorporated within Eskom. Rather than doing that, it is set Eskom up in competition with IPPs. And that's precisely the point in terms of driving a privatized agenda. I mean, renewable energy has the potential to change the landscape of electricity. It has the potential to make energy cheaper, but more importantly, it has the potential to have energy socially owned and for users to be able to produce energy at a household or community level, but also be able to sell the excess energy back to local municipalities, earn an income as a result of energy that they're able to produce via the grid, off the grid, and then push it into the grid and get paid for it. So I mean, the potential of how you can actually transform the energy landscape, communities, through job creation, access to really clean energy, and at the same time have a really positive spin in relation to climate change. All of these things are absolutely positive, but because the South African government is caught up in looking at renewable energy through a private investment framework, where there's people like Patrick Motsepe and others that are friendly with and have particular relations with the ANC, and there's major money to be made from renewable energy and the so-called green investments. That's where the money is, and therefore the beneficiation of what potentially could be, as the comrade was saying, in terms of fundamentally challenging capitalism and moving closer and closer to achieving the objectives of our national democratic revolution. I mean, the renewable energy space would have provided a fundamental opportunity for that. We've consciously chosen to do privatization and to teach the potential of our ESCOM. And I think for the listeners out there, please, if there's anything, do not fall into the trap of believing that when your public entity or your utility that government has invested in for years, and it's through our taxpayers' money and through our taxes, it's actually our entity. It belongs to us as a public. When that infrastructure is given over to the private sector, and the private sector does not invest in something that has no value. They will take over what we have subsidized for years, turn it into something that they believe is profitable, and then they will sell it back to us at tenfold the price. We will lose in the end. So the demand is not to privatize ESCOM or any SOE. So the demand should be for those responsible for leading it to its state of disarray to be held accountable, for corruption to be brought to an end, and those who are guilty of it brought to book. And the state must invest in SOEs and ensure that the utilities that provide rights to us through our constitution are actually upheld. We need to contest privatization in its most perverse form. Thanks.
Well, Hamida, shukran for that. And also to you, Mametle, we thank you for your time. We do appreciate both of you taking time out and spending the last hour in the company of the viewers and listeners at Salam Media and also at ITV. So we wish you all the best. Please take care.
Thank you very much. And we're pleased to be here.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of Wednesday Nights with Inayet Wadee. And once again, it's been wonderful. It's been great being in your company, and a lot to think about. And this obviously is an issue that is not going to go away in a hurry, considering where we are as far as SOEs are concerned. We're still going to see a lot of focus on government itself, and also on the likes of the minister in charge, Pravin Gordhan. And at the end of the day, it is a country, it is, as Hamida mentioned, that these don't belong to private, these are not in the interest of private companies. These are our own interests. These SOEs have been built with taxpayers' money over the years. And if they go, where is this actually going to leave us? And more importantly, when they start shedding jobs at the rate that they are shedding jobs, and we've heard about the post office, 6,000 jobs that are likely to be lost just within the South African post office itself. That alone is a disaster in making. And with that, I'm going to be signing off. Once again, it's been a pleasure being in your company. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.